The humid, stagnant air of the Normandy bocage in late July 1944 was heavy with the stench of decaying vegetation and the metallic tang of high explosive residue that had permeated the soil over weeks of static attritional warfare. For the men of the Panzer Lehr Division, the elite jewel of the German Wehrmacht, the landscape of the Cotentin Peninsula had become a claustrophobic maze of ancient sunken lanes and impenetrable hedgerows. Established as a demonstration unit and composed of the finest instructors and veterans from the armored schools of the Reich, the Panzer Lehr was the only division in the entire German army to be fully mechanized. Every single one of its infantrymen moved in armored SDKFZ 251 half-tracks, and its armored corps was a formidable array of Panzer IVHs and the deadly Panther AUSFG with its high-velocity 75mm gun. They were commanded by General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, a man who had served as Rommel's chief of staff in Africa and who understood the mechanics of mobile warfare better than almost any other officer in the theater. Yet as Bayerlein surveyed his positions along the Saint-Lô to Perriers Road on the morning of July 24, he was possessed by a growing sense of tactical entrapment. His division, which had been designed for the sweeping maneuvers of the Russian steppe, was being bled white in the stagnant mud of the French hedgerows. The Allied forces under General Omar Bradley had recognized that the stalemate in Normandy could only be broken by a massive application of concentrated industrial power that would bypass the tactical limitations of the bocage. This was the genesis of Operation Cobra, a plan that intended to use the full weight of the United States 8th and 9th Air Forces to blast a hole through the German lines through which armored divisions could pour into the open terrain of Brittany. The target of this atmospheric anvil was the narrow sector held by the Panzer Lehr. The division occupied a front roughly 6,000 yards wide and 2,000 yards deep, centered on the vital east-west highway. On July 24, the first attempt at this aerial deluge began. Over 350 heavy bombers and hundreds of fighter bombers appeared over the horizon, but the weather was treacherous with low clouds and shifting winds obscuring the ground targets. In the confusion of the morning, a tragic error occurred as the lead bombardiers of the 8th Air Force released their loads prematurely. The bombs fell short of the German lines, striking the positions of the American 30th Infantry Division and killing dozens of their own men, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. For the Germans on the receiving end, the brief and chaotic bombardment was a terrifying prelude to a violence they could not yet fully comprehend. Bayerlein, watching the smoke rise from the American lines, believed his division had survived the worst the Allied air power had to offer. The following morning, July 25, 1944, brought a clear and pitiless sky over the Normandy countryside. The silence of the dawn was broken not by the usual rhythmic crump of field artillery but by a deep rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. It was the sound of over 1,500 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators assembling in massive combat boxes over the English Channel. Supporting this heavy armada were nearly 400 medium bombers like the B-26 Marauder and more than 500 P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. This was not a tactical strike but a strategic saturation of a microsector. At 9:38 in the morning, the first wave reached the release point. The sky above the Panzer Lehr was suddenly obscured by thousands of falling objects reflecting the morning sun. These were not only heavy 1,000-pound high explosives but millions of small fragmentation bombs designed to shred tires, sever communication wires, and kill any living thing caught in the open. The physics of the saturation bombing were calculated to achieve a total suppression of the defenders. When a 1,000-pound bomb strikes the soft Normandy clay, it creates a crater 20 feet deep and 40 feet wide, displacing hundreds of tons of earth. When 5,000 such bombs fall within a few square miles, the landscape is fundamentally altered. Inside the Panther tanks of the 130th Panzer Regiment, the crews experienced a level of sensory overload that defied description. A 45-ton tank, despite its thick armor, is not a static object during a carpet bombing. The concussion from near misses is transmitted through the steel hull with the force of a massive hammer blow. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, the crews were tossed like dolls against the ammunition racks and the hot engine bulkheads. The dust and smoke sucked in through the cooling fans made breathing nearly impossible, and the vacuum created by the massive detonations threatened to rupture the eardrums of the men within. Many tankers who survived the initial blasts were rendered functionally deaf and blind as their periscopes were shattered and their radio antennas were whipped away by the supersonic blast waves. By 10:30, the area held by the Panzer Lehr had been transformed into what Bayerlein would famously describe as a Mondlandschaft or moon landscape. The ancient roads had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a chaotic overlapping pattern of craters. The hedgerows, which had been the primary defensive asset of the German infantry, were pulverized into splinters of wood and clumps of dirt. But the physical destruction of the equipment was only part of the annihilation. The logistical and command structure of the division was being vaporized in real time. The armored SDKFZ half-tracks of the 901st and 902nd Panzergrenadier regiments, which had been tucked into the shadows of the hedges, were flipped onto their roofs or buried under tons of earth. Fuel trucks and ammunition carriers disintegrated in secondary explosions that added to the inferno. The complex network of telephone wires that allowed Bayerlein to coordinate his battalions was severed in thousands of places, and the dense smoke made visual signaling impossible. The Panzerlehr, which had been a highly integrated mechanized organism, was being systematically reduced to a collection of isolated and shell-shocked individuals wandering in a haze of gray dust. As the heavy bombers completed their passes and turned back toward their bases in England, the second phase of the annihilation began. The medium bombers and fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force descended from the clouds to pick off the survivors. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 850 caliber machine guns and racks of 5-inch rockets, was a particularly lethal instrument of tactical interdiction. The American pilots flying at low altitudes through the smoke could spot the movement of any German unit attempting to regroup. If a Panther tank tried to maneuver out of its cratered position, a flight of Thunderbolts would descend upon it, firing rockets that could penetrate the thin top armor of the turret. The roar of the radial engines and the terrifying whistle of the diving planes created a psychological pressure that broke the will of many veteran soldiers. These were men who had survived the horrors of the Eastern Front, but they had never encountered a force that could project such overwhelming power from the vertical dimension. In the space of 3 hours, the elite Panzerlehr had lost nearly 70% of its combat strength without having fired a single coordinated volley at the American ground troops. General Bayerlein himself narrowly escaped death as his command post was struck multiple times by heavy ordnance. When he finally managed to crawl out of his dugout and survey the remains of his division, he found a scene of total mechanized ruin. In one sector, a platoon of Panzer IV tanks had been buried up to their turrets by the shifting earth of the bomb craters, the crews still inside struggling to dig themselves out while being strafed by Mustangs. In another, a company of Panzergrenadiers had been entirely wiped out, not by direct hits but by the massive atmospheric overpressure that had collapsed their lungs as they sheltered in shallow foxholes. The command and control hierarchy had completely vanished. Battalion commanders were dead or missing, and the survivors were often found sitting in their craters staring blankly into the distance, their minds shattered by the hours of continuous concussive impact. Bayerlein attempted to organize a counterattack with his remaining tanks, but he found that he had fewer than a dozen operational vehicles left in the entire center of his line. While the Panzerlehr was being hammered from the air, the American ground forces of the 7th Corps under Major General J. Lawton Collins were preparing to move into the breach. The 30th and 9th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, began their advance into the moonscape. They expected to find an empty wasteland, but they were met by the few remaining pockets of German resistance. Despite the total annihilation of their structure, small groups of Panzerlehr veterans had survived in the deep dugouts and began to man their MG-42s and remaining 88mm guns. They fought with a desperate fatalistic discipline, but they were fighting a war that had already been lost. The American advance was not a slow grind through the bocage but a rapid mechanized surge. The Sherman tanks equipped with Kulin hedgerow cutters pushed through the few remaining obstacles, while the infantry utilized the massive bomb craters as ready-made trenches. The psychological impact of the bombing was such that many German soldiers surrendered in small groups, their hands raised, their uniforms coated in a thick layer of white dust, looking more like ghosts than the elite soldiers they had been 48 hours prior. By the morning of July 26, the 96-hour window of annihilation was reaching its midpoint. The Panzerlehr, which had begun the month with nearly 15,000 men and over 100 tanks, was now a division in name only. Bayerlein reported to the 7th Army headquarters that his unit was no longer a combat-effective formation. He estimated that he had lost over 3,000 men in the first 2 hours of the bombing alone. The remnants of the division were being pushed back toward the village of Marigny as the American armor began to break out into the open country. This was the moment that Operation Cobra achieved its primary objective. The crust of the German defense had been shattered and there was no mobile reserve left to plug the hole. The Panzerlehr, which had been intended to be that very reserve, had been used as the anvil, and it had been pulverized. The mechanics of the German retreat were as chaotic as the bombardment had been. Because the division was fully mechanized, its survival depended on fuel and roads. With the roads destroyed and the fuel dumps burning, the remaining half-tracks and tanks were forced to maneuver across broken country where they frequently became bogged down in the massive craters. A Panther tank with its complex torsion bar suspension and interlocking wheels was a nightmare to maintain in such conditions. A single thrown track in a bomb crater meant the permanent loss of the vehicle, as there were no recovery tractors left to tow it out. Many crews were forced to sabotage their own tanks and retreat on foot, joining the swelling ranks of disorganized infantry streaming toward the south. The American tactical air power remained relentless, strafing the retreating columns and destroying the horse-drawn artillery and supply wagons of the supporting divisions, which were now caught in the same vortex of destruction. On July 27, the final act of the 96-hour annihilation unfolded. The American 3rd Armored Division, known as the Spearhead, bypassed the ruins of the Panzer Lair and began the rapid drive toward Coutances and Avranches. The German High Command, including Field Marshal von Kluge, realized that the Normandy front had finally collapsed. The sacrifice of the Panzer Lair had been for nothing. The division had been positioned to hold the gate, but the gate had been obliterated along with its guardians. The remnants of the unit, numbering fewer than 1,500 combat-effective troops, were pulled back toward the Seine River. They had lost almost every piece of heavy equipment they had brought into Normandy. The meticulously trained instructors and the factory-fresh tanks were now twisted metal and scorched earth in the fields around St. Lo. The legacy of the Panzer Lair at St. Lo is a stark testament to the total nature of industrial warfare in the mid-20th century. It demonstrated that even the most elite, highly trained and well-equipped ground formation could not survive the concentrated application of tactical and strategic air power. The transition from the meat grinder of the bocage to the rapid breakout of the French interior was paved by the thousands of tons of ordnance that rained down on Bayerlein's men. For the German soldiers who survived those 96 hours, the experience remained the defining trauma of their lives. They had been taught that the Panzer was the master of the battlefield, but they had learned that the master of the sky was the master of all. The annihilation of the Panzer Lair was not just the destruction of a division, but the symbolic death of the Wehrmacht as a mobile fighting force in the West. From this point forward, the German army in France would be an army in retreat, its maneuvers dictated not by its own commanders but by the schedules of the Allied air fleets and the relentless logistics of the American war machine. In the decades following the war, military historians and analysts have pored over the data of Operation Cobra, examining the density of the bomb patterns and the psychological effects of the saturation. They found that while the direct physical destruction of armored vehicles by heavy bombs was statistically lower than initially believed, the total systemic collapse of the division was absolute. The bombing destroyed the soul of the unit. It severed the invisible bonds of communication and trust that allow 15,000 men to function as a single lethal entity. When a sergeant can no longer speak to his lieutenant and a tank commander can no longer see his wingman, the division ceases to exist regardless of how many guns are still operational. The 96-hour window from July 24 to July 27, 1944 was the moment when the German army realized that the era of their tactical dominance was over, replaced by the era of the industrial avalanche. The Panzer Lair, which had been built to demonstrate the future of German armored might, instead became a demonstration of its inevitable end. The landscape today around the St. Lo to Perrier's road has largely recovered, the craters filled in by decades of farming and the hedgerows regrown in the quiet cycles of rural life. But beneath the topsoil, the fragments of the Panzer Lair remain. Pieces of track links, shattered 88mm casings, and the rusted remains of SDKFC components are still occasionally unearthed by the plow. They serve as silent witnesses to those 4 days in July when the sky fell on the finest division in the Reich. General Bayerlein, who would go on to command the division through the Ardennes offensive and the final defense of the Ruhr, never forgot the sight of his men wandering through the white dust of the moonscape. He understood that at Salerno and again at St. Lo, the Allies had perfected a method of war that rendered the traditional virtues of the Prussian officer corps obsolete. The annihilation of the Panzer Lair was the final proof that in the face of total air supremacy and limitless industrial production, courage and training were no longer enough to hold the line against the encroaching tide of the 20th century. The structural impact of the Panzer Lair's destruction reverberated throughout the entire German defense of Western Europe. Because this division had been composed of the elite training cadre of the Panzertruppen, its loss meant that the institutional knowledge of the German armored forces was being rapidly depleted. The men who should have been teaching the next generation of tankers how to fight were instead dying in the craters of Normandy. This accelerated the decline in the quality of the German armored replacements, leading to the poorly coordinated and desperate offensives of late 1944 and 1945. The annihilation at St. Lo was thus a strategic wound that never truly healed. It was a localized apocalypse that foreshadowed the general collapse of the Third Reich, a 96-hour window where the future of the war was decided not by a clash of steel on the ground but by a storm of fire from the heavens that wiped a legend off the map and changed the course of history. As the American armor poured through the gap created by the destruction of the lair, they encountered a landscape that was eerie in its stillness. The massive bombing had not only killed the soldiers but had silenced the very birds and insects of the Normandy summer. The GIs of the 4th and 2nd Armored Divisions drove their Shermans past the smoldering ruins of Panthers and the abandoned gear of an army in flight. They saw the bodies of elite Panzergrenadiers half buried in the dirt, their uniforms stripped of insignia by the blast waves. There was a sense of somber awe among the victors, realizing that they were witnessing the results of a power that had never before been seen in human conflict. The breakthrough was so rapid that within days the Allies had captured thousands of square miles of French territory and were racing toward Paris. The 96 hours of terror for the Panzer Lehr had bought the Allies the liberation of a continent and the destruction of the myth of German invincibility in the West. The technical specifications of the munitions used during Operation Cobra further illustrate the brutality of the annihilation. The 9th Air Force utilized the M41 fragmentation bomb, a 20-pound weapon that was dropped in clusters of 6 or more. These clusters would burst at a predetermined altitude of roughly 500 feet, scattering the individual bombs over a wide area. Each bomb contained a high explosive core surrounded by a tightly wound coil of square steel wire which would shatter into thousands of razor-sharp fragments upon detonation. For the soft-skinned vehicles and exposed infantry of the Panzer Lehr, these fragmentation clusters were more terrifying than the heavy 1,000-pounders. They created a saturation of shrapnel that made movement above ground suicidal. When combined with the high-explosive GP bombs which were fused to penetrate the earth before exploding, the result was a two-tiered system of destruction that targeted both the physical fortifications and the mobile assets of the division. Bayerlein's tactical reports following the breakthrough also highlighted the catastrophic failure of the German air defense. The Panzer Lehr possessed its own organic anti-aircraft battalion equipped with the highly effective 20mm Flak 38 and the 37mm Flak 36. However, during the carpet bombing, these batteries were as vulnerable as the tanks. The crews were unable to remain at their guns amidst the falling 1,000-pounders, and the few who did were instantly spotted and vaporized by the low-flying P-47 Thunderbolts. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to provide an air umbrella over the elite formations, was almost entirely absent. Only a few scattered flights of Focke-Wulf 190s attempted to intervene, and they were quickly overwhelmed by the massive American fighter screen. The Panzer Lehr was forced to endure the 96 hours in a state of total aerial nakedness, a condition that would become the standard experience for the German army for the remainder of the war. The psychological disintegration of the Panzer Lehr was also a key factor in the rapid collapse of the front. Military psychologists studying the effects of saturation bombing on elite units noted that the sense of total helplessness in the face of an unavoidable and invisible threat is the most rapid catalyst for combat fatigue. The men of the Lehr were trained to fight an enemy they could see and engage with their superior weapons. When that enemy remained 5 miles in the air and destroyed them with impunity, the very foundation of their military identity was shattered. The elite status of the division, which had been a source of immense pride, instead became a psychological burden as the men realized that even their superior training could not save them from the atmospheric anvil. By the time the American infantry reached the German foxholes, they often found soldiers who were not just willing to surrender but who were in a state of catatonic shock, unable to even process the reality of their capture. The final tally of the Panzer Lehr's losses over those 4 days is a grim statistic of the Normandy campaign. Beyond the thousands of killed and wounded, the division had lost nearly its entire inventory of heavy weapons. The 91 tanks that had been operational on the morning of July 24 were reduced to a mere 14 by July 27. The hundreds of SDKFZ half-tracks which made the division the mobile envy of the Wehrmacht were reduced to a handful of battered and fuel-starved vehicles. The division had essentially been erased as a mechanized formation. While it would eventually be rebuilt with new recruits and equipment, it would never again possess the same density of veteran instructors and technical expertise that had made it so formidable at the start of the summer. The 96-hour annihilation at St. Lo was the moment the Panzer Lehr died, and with it the last best hope of the German army to contain the Allied breakout from the Normandy beaches. As the sun set on July 27, 1944, the dust finally began to settle over the St. Lo to Perrier's road. The fires in the fuel dumps had burned down to smoldering embers, and the roar of the B-17s had faded into a distant memory. The silence of the moonscape was now the silence of the victor. The American 4th Armored Division was already miles to the south, its tracks churning up the summer dust of the open French plains. Behind them they left a graveyard of an elite formation, a testament to the fact that in the era of total industrial warfare there is no defense against a sky that has turned against you. The 96-hour annihilation of the Panzer Lehr remains a harrowing chapter in the history of the Second World War, a clinical demonstration of the power of air supremacy to reshape the geography and the destiny of nations in a single violent weekend. It was the day the Lehr learned that the machine they served was ultimately less powerful than the machine that hunted them from above, and it was the day that the road to Berlin was finally thrown wide open.